Chinese stocks have had the worst performance among the world's largest stock markets. That's according to the Morgan Stanley Capital International, or MSCI's April data. Since it began in 1992, the MSCI China Index has returned only slightly over 1% per year. That's significantly lower than the returns of MSCI's Emerging Markets Index and its flagship Global Stock Index. Meanwhile, stock market investors in the U.S. have enjoyed higher gains. The MSCI USA Index has been generating an annual return of 11% since 1987. Kyle Bass is the Chief Investment Officer of Heyman Capital Management. He told the Epoch Times in an interview, China uses the West's money and pays almost zero returns for enormous risk, and that fiduciaries should be sued for investing in the Chinese Communist regime. Robin Parbrook is the co-head of Asian Equity Alternative Investments at Schroders, a global investment management firm. He warns it's important for investors to realize that stock market returns and economic growth do not correlate. The MSCI China Index consists of large and medium-sized company stocks that trade on both Chinese and global stock markets. Parbrook compared the performance of the MSCI China Index against that of MSCI indexes of other Asian countries in October. He discovered that Chinese stocks had been the weakest performance since 1992. According to the Institute of International Finance, or IFF, capital outflows from China in the first quarter of this year hit a new record. The reasons include COVID lockdowns, Beijing's clampdown on private companies, and China's strained relations with Western countries. Canada's public safety minister is calling attention to gear made by Chinese tech giants Huawei and ZTE. He says the equipment could present a high risk to the country's telecommunications sector.
Canada is a country where people can innovate and start new businesses and leverage new technologies in 5G and beyond. But we also need to safeguard against the risks which can be exploited within those networks.
Canadian companies are now required to remove any existing Huawei and ZTE equipment in their 5G networks by June 2024 and any 4G equipment by December 2027. But Beijing isn't taking the move kindly. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said it strongly opposes the decision and will take necessary measures to combat it. Banning the gear means Canada now joins the rest of the Five Eyes alliance in blocking out Chinese telecom providers. The intelligence sharing network links Canada with four others: the United States, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, all of which have already banned the equipment. Canada is the last to do so because of complications with the Chinese Communist Party. Canada first pointed out the national security threats posed by the Chinese equipment in 2018. Later the same year, on a U.S. warrant, Canada arrested Huawei Chief Financial Officer Meng Wanzhou. Soon after that, Beijing arrested two Canadians for what Chinese authorities called espionage. This back and forth ended last year when Meng was released and went back to China. Beijing also released the two Canadians the same day. The U.S. has added Huawei to a trade blacklist. It says Huawei and ZTE have links to the Chinese military. Another aspect in energy sector is related to electric vehicles, and China is also dominant in part of the supply chain. It has to do with the Biden administration's urging to boost electric vehicle use. The plan looks to help achieve climate goals, but it may have an unintended consequence. On the flip side of lowering emissions, more electric cars on the road might deepen America's dependence on a certain Chinese supply chain. For the first time ever, production of electric vehicles, or EVs, used up more cobalt than smartphones and personal computers last year. Cobalt is a rare metal needed to make lithium-ion batteries. Data shows that EV production used nearly 60,000 tons of cobalt in 2021, 34% of all cobalt demand. Making mobile phones used around 15%, and personal computers totaled only 9%. Those numbers are a reflection of the growing EV market. A report from the International Energy Agency says EV sales doubled in 2021, from 4% in 2020 to 8.5% in the next year. The large use of cobalt highlights a big obstacle for the EV industry, sourcing enough material to make the batteries. Cobalt is a huge problem. 3/4 of it comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where China and London dominate metals mining. The second largest cobalt supplier is Australia. But according to the Cobalt Institute, Australia provides only around 3% of the cobalt supply. As supply chains continue shifting out of China beyond Mexico, another indicator of that change may lie in China's neighbor, Vietnam. The country's exports soar as manufacturers shift away from China's tech capital, Shenzhen. According to Wind, a China-based financial information service provider, Vietnam's exports jumped by over 30% in April from a year ago. That's after record high exports in March. And the level of manufacturing interest has proven significant. CNBC cited Vishrat Rana, a Singapore-based economist, as saying that Vietnam has become a very key supply chain node for consumer electronics. According to Vietnam's official data, the country's exports reached a value of nearly $35 billion in March. Whereas in China's tech capital, Shenzhen, official data shows its exports were valued at just under $18 billion. That's a 14% drop from last year. For the first time in 3 decades, Vietnam's exports beat Shenzhen in 2018, and the difference between the two has been increasing since then. Tech giants like Apple, Intel, Samsung Electronics, and LG have started investing in Vietnam and are slowly moving their production lines out of China. Though the issue of supply chains moving out of China is far from a new topic, China's tightened pandemic control seems to have brought it back into the spotlight. But implementing big change may not come easily. Experts say the corporate withdrawal from China may not be enough to change the country's role in global supply chains. But lockdown-driven shakeups are impacting more than just Chinese manufacturing. Vacation rental company Airbnb is closing its domestic business in China. The company will be taking down its listings in the country starting this summer.
Airbnb made the announcement on Tuesday. Its business in China has been on the decline because of the country's COVID-19 lockdowns. Headquartered in San Francisco, Airbnb launched in China's market back in 2016. Citing insiders, CNBC says that market has accounted for approximately 1% of the company's revenue for the last few years. Many multinational companies operating in China are struggling, as officials in the country continue to pursue a zero COVID-19 policy, a strategy that has badly dented the economy and disrupted almost every major line of business.
Next, we'd like to take a moment to answer a question from our audience. They asked for a closer look at the suppression of ethnic groups in China, including Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongolians. Since the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949, it began to suppress all Chinese people, including members of ethnic groups. In China, the Han ethnic group makes up 94% of China's population. The rest of the country's more than 50 ethnic groups make up the other 6%. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the Chinese Communist Party launched a series of political movements. According to research, 80 million people died during those campaigns. Many were executed or died because of the Great Famine in 1959 to 1961. That 80 million death toll is higher than both world wars combined. Han Chinese made up most of the toll, but ethnic groups are said to have suffered more as they launched even stronger protests. According to official figures, in some areas of Tibet in the 60s, the ratio of young and middle-aged men to women dropped to 1:7, or even lower in some cases. That was the result of mass arrests and killings driven by the regime. At the same time, the CCP pushed a relocation campaign, moving Han Chinese to areas largely home to other ethnic groups, turning them into minorities in their own regions. The regime also restricted them from using their native languages and practicing their religious beliefs. This aimed to eliminate their cultural identity and has continued until today. Han Chinese suffered similar problems too. Ancient Chinese Han culture is deeply rooted in Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. It's based on universal values such as compassion, righteousness, wisdom, and faith. But the CCP has replaced these with communist culture, steeped in lies, cover-ups, and violence. Communism is also inherently atheist and directs people to worship communist leaders instead. In this sense, the conflict can't be viewed as conflict between the Han Chinese and other ethnic minorities, but as one between the communist regime and all Chinese people, regardless of their ethnic roots. Meanwhile, the CCP has been using Han Chinese to achieve its goals by suppressing other ethnic groups.